Hi, and welcome back to Family Shadows, where ordinary fathers face extraordinary trials and quiet justice finds its way back home. If you believe in family, in love that lingers even through disappointment, and in the quiet strength of fathers who are too often underestimated, then you are in the right place. Before we begin, take a moment to subscribe to our channel. Every story here carries a piece of legacy, a whisper of lessons passed down through generations. And today's story, well, it might remind you of how fragile trust can be and how wisdom, even when quiet, can shield a man from betrayal. Today's story is titled, "My son tried forcing me to sign everything, but the bank manager read my note." Now, let's begin. The morning light in small-town Michigan always had a certain way of settling into the windows, soft, forgiving, not too sharp. Richard Walker noticed it that day as he buttoned the cuffs of his pale blue shirt. He had owned that shirt for nearly a decade, the cotton worn smooth by years of Sunday services, graduations, and doctor's appointments. Today it would accompany him to something less ordinary, a meeting at the bank with his son. At 62, Richard had lived long enough to know that most things people called urgent were rarely that. Bills arrived, cars broke down, roofs leaked. Life had a way of pushing forward whether you rushed to meet it or not. But when Daniel, his only son, called 2 nights earlier and insisted on setting up a bank meeting, Richard heard a tone that unsettled him. "Dad," Daniel had said, voice low but clipped, "we just need to go over some paperwork. It's for everyone's good. You'll just sign where I tell you, and it'll make things easier for the family." Richard remembered holding the phone in silence, listening not only to his son's words but to the hurriedness beneath them. It wasn't the sound of someone helping his father. It was the sound of someone who wanted something done quickly, before the chance of hesitation could bloom. Now, standing in his small kitchen, Richard poured coffee into a chipped mug that once bore his late wife Margaret's favorite floral pattern. Half the flowers had faded with time. He traced the rim with his finger before lifting it to his lips. Margaret had always been the cautious one. She would say things like, "Rick, don't sign anything unless you've read it 3 times. And if you still don't feel right, fold it up and walk away." She had been gone for nearly 8 years, yet her voice sat beside him that morning as though she had only stepped out to tend the garden. Richard finished his coffee, slipped on a jacket, and took one last look at the framed photo by the counter. Margaret, holding little Daniel at the lake, both smiling like the world would never turn on them. How did we get here? He wondered. The bank smelled of polished wood and printer ink, a sterile kind of cleanliness that made everyone sit up straighter. Daniel was already there, standing near the front desk, his phone in hand. He wore a suit that was one size too slim, his tie knotted with an impatience Richard recognized from his younger years. "Dad," Daniel said, waving him over, "you made it. Good. We've got everything ready. Shouldn't take long." Melissa, his daughter-in-law, sat nearby with a rehearsed smile, the kind you give to a neighbor whose name you can't recall. "Hi, Mr. Walker," she said, her tone light but her eyes already drifting back to the stack of folders on the desk. And then there was Emily, Richard's 10-year-old granddaughter, swinging her legs from the chair too tall for her. When she saw him, she ran over and hugged him tight around the waist. "Grandpa," she said, her voice muffled against his jacket, "Mom says we're helping you today." Richard managed a smile and patted her back. "Is that right?" Emily nodded, then tilted her head. "But why do you have to sign so many papers?" Her innocence cut through the air like a bell in an empty church. Melissa cleared her throat, Daniel shot a look at his daughter, and Richard only smiled faintly. "Let's sit," Daniel said quickly, gesturing toward a polished oak table where a bank associate had laid out several documents. Richard took his seat slowly, every movement deliberate, as though his bones had grown heavier overnight. The papers in front of him looked like any other stack of contracts. Bold titles, paragraphs of fine print, signature lines marked with bright yellow tabs. To most, it would appear as harmless routine, just another layer of modern life's endless bureaucracy. But Richard's eyes, trained from years of accounting work, scanned the margins, the tiny notes, the shifting legal language. He couldn't catch it all at once, but he sensed enough. Daniel leaned forward. "Dad, this is just about consolidating things, streamlining. We put the properties, the accounts, into one trust. It'll save everyone headaches down the road, trust me on this." Richard didn't reply immediately. He traced the edge of the paper with his finger, consolidating, streamlining, words that sounded smooth but often hid rough truths. Melissa chimed in. "It's really simple, Mr. Walker. Just a signature here, here, and here." She tapped the yellow tabs with a manicured nail. Emily, from her chair, asked again, "Why so many signatures?" Nobody answered her this time. Richard glanced at Daniel. His son's jaw was tight, his smile thin. It wasn't the smile of a child happy to help his father. It was the grin of a man standing on the edge of victory, waiting for the final push. Richard's hand trembled slightly as he lifted the pen. He thought of Margaret again, of her steady eyes that always seemed to see 2 steps ahead. He could almost hear her whisper, "Don't let love blind you, Rick. Even with family, be careful." The room felt smaller. The air, thicker. He hadn't signed yet, but he could feel the trap closing in. Richard set the pen down. "I'd like to read it first," he said softly. Daniel forced a laugh. "Dad, come on, you don't need to read every line. That's why I'm here. I've already gone through it." "But it's my name," Richard replied, his voice steady, "and my life." Melissa's smile faded. Daniel's eyes darkened. And just like that, the first fissure in the facade appeared. Richard could feel Daniel's stare pressing against him, as if impatience alone might force the pen back into his hand. The silence between them was a wire pulled too tight, vibrating with an invisible strain. Finally, Daniel leaned forward, elbows on the polished table, his voice edged with the sharpness of someone used to being obeyed. "Dad," he said, tapping the paper with the end of his finger, "we don't have all day. Just sign where I showed you. This isn't complicated." The words landed like a command, not a request. Richard lowered his eyes to the documents. The black print blurred, not because he couldn't read, but because every line seemed to carry a weight heavier than ink. He had balanced ledgers for 30 years. He knew what numbers meant. He knew what trust meant. And more than anything, he knew what it meant when someone wanted him to look away instead of looking closer. Melissa shifted in her chair, her practiced sweetness cracking just a little. "It really is just paperwork, Mr. Walker. A trust, you know. Families do this all the time. Keeps everything smooth when..." She stopped herself before finishing the sentence. "When you're gone." Richard caught the words she didn't say. Emily, his granddaughter, swung her legs under the chair and asked again, "Why does Grandpa have to sign so many papers? Can't it wait?" "Emily," Daniel snapped, his tone colder than the bank's air-conditioned lobby, "this is adult business. You don't understand." The little girl shrank back, confused by her father's sharpness. She looked up at Richard with wide eyes, searching for something steady, something safe. Richard reached across the table and placed his weathered hand over hers. "It's all right, sweetheart," he whispered. Sometimes grown-ups forget what's really important. Daniel exhaled hard through his nose. Dad, don't start making this more dramatic than it is. I'm trying to help you to help all of us. You've got property, accounts, assets scattered everywhere. This consolidates everything under one name under the trust. That's the smart way. One name, Richard asked quietly. Whose name, Daniel? Daniel hesitated, but only for a second. Mine, I'll be the executor, it makes sense. I can manage it better than anyone. There it was, the truth that sat behind all the careful words. Richard studied his son's face. There was no shame in Daniel's eyes, no hesitation now, only hunger, the kind that grows when a man convinces himself he deserves more than what's been given. Melissa smiled thinly, leaning into her husband's shoulder as though to lend him weight. It's really the best thing for the family. You don't need the burden of decisions at your age. At your age. Richard felt the words slice through him, colder than any bank air could be. He was not feeble. His hands still built shelves in his workshop, still tilled the soil of the small garden Margaret once loved. Yet here he was, being spoken of as though he were an old coat to be folded and put away. He lifted the pen again, not to sign, but to buy time. His hand hovered above the line, his pulse thudding in his fingertips. Across the table, Daniel's eyes gleamed, his lips twitching with anticipation, as if victory was already his. Richard thought of Margaret's handwriting, her notes in the margins of grocery lists, her recipes tucked into cookbooks, her birthday cards with looping letters that always said more than the words themselves. She had taught him that writing could hold more than meaning, it could hold protection. Dad, Daniel pressed, his voice lowering, stop overthinking this. Sign, right now. The command rang through the sterile room, harsh enough that the associate behind the desk glanced up, startled, then quickly looked away. Richard set the pen down again. His hand did not shake this time. Not yet, he said, his voice calm but carrying something deeper than refusal, something closer to defiance. Daniel's jaw tightened. Melissa's smile vanished, and little Emily, still holding her grandfather's hand, squeezed it tighter, as though she knew something was about to break open. The pen lay on the table between Richard and his son, a small, ordinary object that suddenly felt as heavy as the roof beams he had once carried in his youth. His hand hovered near it, not because he intended to sign, but because he knew the room was watching. Daniel with his restless tapping fingers, Melissa with her fixed smile, and Emily with her wide, unblinking eyes. For a long moment, Richard did not move. He stared at the lines of text before him, the legal clauses strung together like a net designed to catch something that couldn't be seen until it was too late. He had read enough contracts in his working life to recognize one thing. When words seemed too neat, they were hiding something. Dad, Daniel said again, softer now but sharper all the same, don't make this harder than it is. You've always trusted me. You raised me to handle things. Why not let me handle this? Richard's throat tightened. Trust. That word had once carried light, the way Margaret used it when she asked him to drive her home in the rain, or when she leaned against him during church and whispered, I trust you'll know what to do. But here in his son's mouth it carried a different weight, something closer to demand than devotion. He glanced at Melissa, who folded her arms and looked at him with the kind of patience people wear when they are waiting for someone to finally give in. Mr. Walker, she said, the syrup in her tone thinning, you don't need to carry all of this anymore. It's a lot for one person. Richard thought of his workshop, the smell of cedar shavings, the careful shelves lined with jars of screws and nails, each labeled in Margaret's tidy handwriting. He still worked there, still repaired the hinges of neighbors' doors, still sanded picture frames for church raffles. He was not useless, not a man whose life had shrunk to paper and signatures. His hand trembled as he touched the edge of the first page. He turned it slowly as though reading, though the words blurred again. His hesitation was not because he couldn't read, but because the act itself, the act of bending his name to someone else's will, felt like handing over every year he and Margaret had worked for. Emily's voice broke through the silence. "Grandpa," she said softly, "do you want to sign it?" The question startled everyone. Melissa stiffened, Daniel closed his eyes with visible frustration, but Richard looked at his granddaughter as though she were the only honest person in the room. "No, Emily," he said quietly, "I don't." The girl's hand squeezed his again, and for the first time that morning Richard felt steady. Daniel leaned back in his chair, exhaling hard. "Dad, you're overthinking this. You don't have to read it. You don't have to worry. That's the point. We're trying to relieve you of the burden. Just sign it for me." The last two words hit Richard harder than he expected. For me. He had spent a lifetime doing things for his son, working late hours so Daniel could have new cleats for baseball, skipping vacations so tuition could be paid, swallowing pride so that the boy could walk into the world without knowing how many nights his father went without sleep. And now here he was, being asked for the last thing he had left to give. Richard closed the folder, sliding it back across the table. His voice was steady but soft, almost a whisper. "Not yet," he said. "Not today." Daniel's face hardened. "Dad," but Richard didn't look at him. His eyes had drifted somewhere else. Back to the memory of Margaret, back to the voice that told him long ago, "If something doesn't feel right, Rick, don't put your name on it. Your name is your life." And in that moment, hesitation became more than delay. It became resistance. The weight of the folder still lingered in Richard's hands, though he had already pushed it aside. Across the table, Daniel's voice buzzed with restrained frustration, but Richard's mind had slipped away, carried on a current that no one else in the room could follow. He saw Margaret. It was always in the quiet moments that she returned to him, not in dreams, not in visions, but in the everyday silence that left space for memory to breathe. Now, in this sterile bank office, her presence filled the air more vividly than the faint scent of printer ink. He remembered her laughter in the kitchen on summer mornings when the windows were open and the scent of lilacs drifted in. She'd hum while she cooked, off-key but full of joy, as if she knew that happiness was not about perfect notes but about sharing the tune. He remembered the way she'd sit with him at the old oak dining table, long before that table was replaced with newer, shinier furniture Daniel insisted on when he remodeled the house. Margaret would place a stack of bills between them, smoothing each one with care. "Rick," she'd say, "we may not have much, but what we do have, we'll protect it. For the kids, for us." And she always meant protect, not spend. She believed stewardship was love in action. The memory shifted, and suddenly Richard was back at her hospital bedside, the heart monitor beeping steadily as she reached for his hand. Her fingers were thin, her skin cool, but her eyes were as steady as ever. "Don't let anyone rush you," she whispered, her breath a fragile ribbon of sound. "Especially not with signatures. A man's name is the last thing he owns outright. Guard it, Rick. Guard it even from the ones you love." He hadn't understood, not fully, what she meant back then. He thought it was the illness speaking, the fear of what would happen after she was gone. But now, sitting across from his son, with the pen waiting like a blade, he realized she had seen further than he ever could. His fingers twitched on the table, not for the pen but for the comfort of the note he had tucked into his jacket pocket that morning. A note he had written in his own handwriting, folded carefully, placed in an envelope addressed to the bank manager. Margaret's words had guided that decision. Quiet wisdom turned into quiet armor. "Dad," Daniel's voice cut back into his reverie, irritated now. "Are you even listening?" Richard looked up, blinking back the memory, but her voice lingered in his chest. He met his son's eyes, not with anger, but with a calm that startled Daniel more than any raised voice could. "I'm listening," Richard said, his tone even. "To you, to everything." But inside he was still listening to her, always to her. Emily tugged on his sleeve, her small voice breaking through the tension. "Grandma used to say you were stubborn." She giggled softly, almost as if repeating a secret she had overheard. Richard smiled, the corners of his mouth curling with both pain and gratitude. "She did say that," he whispered back, "and maybe she was right." Melissa shifted uncomfortably, as if the mention of Margaret unsettled her, pulled something pure into a room too thick with hidden agendas. For Richard, though, the memory was not unsettling. It was a lantern in a dark corridor, reminding him of the promise he had made, to her, to himself. He placed both hands flat on the table, steady now. His hesitation was no longer weakness, it was choice. And choice, Richard realized, was power. The room seemed smaller now. The steady hum of the air conditioner filled the silence like a second heartbeat, cool but suffocating. Richard sat with his palms flat on the table, his back straighter than before. The memories of Margaret still lingered, giving him strength, but across from him, Daniel shifted in his chair, the smile gone, replaced by an edge of irritation sharp enough to cut glass. "Dad," Daniel said, his voice lower, more forceful, "we can't sit here all day. The bank has other appointments. Just sign the papers." His words had lost the thin veneer of patience. Now they came out clipped, rushed, almost desperate. Melissa placed a hand on Daniel's arm, but her attempt at gentleness rang hollow. "Mr. Walker, we're only thinking of the family. It's time to make these decisions. You don't want things to get complicated later." Richard caught the hesitation in her voice. Later, when he was gone, they were talking about his life as though it had already slipped from his hands. "I'm not gone yet," Richard said softly, surprising even himself with the firmness in his tone. Daniel leaned forward, eyes flashing. "But you will be. Don't you get it? This isn't about you anymore. It's about the future. About me, about us, taking care of what's left. If you love us, you'll do this. Right now." The words struck like hammer blows, each one meant to weaken the resolve he had been gathering. Richard felt Emily's little hand clutch his sleeve tighter, as if she could sense the storm building. The banker at the far desk shifted awkwardly in his chair, clearly aware of the growing tension but unwilling to interfere. Only Mr. Harris, the bank manager, stood near the doorway, his sharp eyes flicking between father and son. He said nothing yet, but Richard knew he was watching closely. Daniel tapped the pen against the table, the sound echoing louder than it should have. "You always said I was the one who'd carry things forward. You always told me I'd be the head of the family one day. Well, this is it. This is where that starts, so don't drag it out. Sign the damn papers." Richard's chest tightened. He could feel his pulse pounding in his temples. Margaret's voice whispered in his mind, "Guard your name, Rick." Melissa leaned closer now, her voice a whisper coated in sugar. "Think of Emily. Don't you want her to grow up secure with everything handled neatly? Isn't that what Margaret would have wanted?" Richard's breath caught. To hear his wife's name used as leverage by someone who had never known the real depth of her sacrifices made something stir in him, something deeper than hesitation, deeper than fear. His hand shook as he reached for the pen again. not because he was ready to sign, but because the pressure had grown unbearable. Daniel's eyes gleamed with victory. Melissa's lips curved into a smile. Even Emily looked up at him, worried, sensing something was wrong but too young to give it words. The tip of the pen hovered above the paper, the line waiting like a trap. The silence in the room was so complete, Richard could hear the faint ticking of the wall clock. His son's voice cut through the stillness. "Do it, Dad, right now. Don't make me ask again." Richard's hand trembled. Every muscle in his arm fought against the weight of the moment. He could feel the trap snapping shut, the pressure pressing down with unbearable force. And yet, inside his jacket pocket, he could feel the faint outline of the envelope he had written days earlier. A note, his safeguard. For the first time that morning, a flicker of calm passed through him. The storm was raging, yes, but he was not unarmed. He lowered the pen, slowly, deliberately, but not onto the paper. Instead, he placed it gently back on the table. "I said," Richard whispered, his voice steady now, "not yet." The words fell like stones in water, sending ripples through the room. Daniel's face darkened, Melissa stiffened, and even the banker at the far desk looked up, startled. The pressure had reached its breaking point. The silence in the room after Richard's whisper was heavy, like the pause between a lightning strike and the thunder that must follow. Daniel stared at his father, his jaw clenched so tightly the muscles twitched. Melissa shifted in her seat, her hand hovering near her husband's arm as if to hold him back from saying something he couldn't take back. Then, the sound of measured footsteps filled the space. Mr. Harris, the bank manager, stepped closer to the table. He was a tall man, his shoulders squared in a way that carried both authority and calm. His gray hair was neatly combed back, his suit pressed with the kind of precision only years of discipline could teach. Unlike the associate behind the desk, who kept his eyes fixed on his computer screen as if hoping to vanish, Harris carried himself as someone unafraid of tension. "Mr. Walker," he said evenly, addressing Richard but glancing briefly at Daniel and Melissa, "perhaps before we move forward there is something we should clarify." Daniel let out a short, irritated laugh. "Clarify what? We've explained everything. Dad just needs to sign." But Harris raised a hand slightly, the gesture enough to silence him. His voice wasn't loud, but it had weight, the kind of weight that made people stop. "This morning," Harris continued, "an envelope was delivered to my office. It came from you, Mr. Walker." Richard's eyes met his, steady, grateful. He nodded once. Daniel froze. "What envelope?" Harris reached into the inside pocket of his suit and withdrew a neatly folded envelope, still sealed. On the front, written in Richard's careful, deliberate handwriting, were the words, "To be opened only in the presence of my son, Daniel Walker, and the bank staff." Melissa's eyes widened. Daniel's face paled. "What is this?" Daniel demanded, his voice sharp, cracking at the edges. "It is," Harris replied, "a note your father left with us to be read before any signatures are made. We honor these requests for the protection of our clients." He broke the seal with deliberate slowness, sliding the paper free. The crisp sound of unfolding filled the silence, each crease opening like the turn of a lock. Daniel leaned forward, his face taut with anger. "This is unnecessary. It's private business. He doesn't know what he's doing." Harris ignored him. His eyes scanned the note briefly before lifting his voice, clear and steady, as he began to read aloud. "I, Richard Walker, declare that no document, trust, or account shall be altered under duress, persuasion, or without my clear and willing consent. If at any time I appear pressured or uncertain, I request the bank to withhold all transactions. My assets remain under my name until I, and I alone, decide otherwise. This is my wish, and it is final." The words hung in the air like church bells, undeniable and resonant. Emily gasped softly, her little hand clutching tighter at her grandfather's sleeve. Melissa's lips parted, but no words came. And Daniel's face flushed red, the kind of red that comes when pride collides with exposure. Richard sat back in his chair, his expression calm. For the first time all morning, he didn't feel cornered. He felt free. "Mr." Harris folded the paper neatly and placed it back into the envelope. "As bank policy," he said, "we cannot proceed with any transaction that contradicts these written instructions. I trust that is clear." The silence that followed was thick but different now, no longer suffocating. It was the silence of truth having been laid bare. Daniel swallowed hard, his eyes darting between his father and the manager. "You," he began, but the words faltered. "You set me up." Richard shook his head gently. "No, son, I protected myself, that's all." And for the first time in years, the balance of power between father and son shifted, not with anger, not with force, but with quiet preparation. The room seemed to tilt after Mr. Harris's words. For a long moment, no one spoke. The paper lay folded neatly on the desk, as harmless in appearance as any grocery list, yet it carried more weight than all the contracts stacked before it. Daniel's mouth opened, then closed again. His eyes darted from his father to the manager to Melissa, as though searching for an ally, someone to dismiss what had just been said. But the truth had a way of silencing rooms. Melissa shifted uncomfortably, her hand sliding away from Daniel's arm. She tried a thin smile, but it flickered and died. Emily, wide-eyed, whispered the obvious. Grandpa won. Her innocence was disarming. It cracked something in the air that had been building for years. Daniel slammed his palm against the table, the sound startling even himself. "This isn't fair," he barked, his voice echoing across the polished wood. You can't just spring something like this. You don't know what you're doing, Dad. You don't understand how complicated all this is." Richard met his son's anger with steady calm. His voice, when it came, was quiet but unshaken. "I understand more than you think. I understand that trust is not something taken, it's something earned. And today, Daniel, you didn't earn it." The words landed harder than any shout could have. Daniel's fists tightened. He turned to Harris, desperation in his voice. "You can't take this seriously. He's old, he's confused. You can't let one little note stop this process." But Harris only adjusted his glasses, his expression unmoved. "Mr. Walker's instructions are clear, legally binding and final. Unless he chooses otherwise, no transfer can occur. I will not allow this bank to be complicit in coercion." The word hung there, coercion. Melissa's face paled. Daniel sat back, his shoulders slumping as though the ground had given way beneath him. He looked suddenly smaller, not the commanding man who had strode into the bank certain of victory, but a boy caught red-handed, exposed by the very father he thought he could outmaneuver. Richard didn't gloat. He didn't raise his voice. He simply folded his hands together the way Margaret used to when she prayed before dinner. "I spent my whole life giving," he said softly, his eyes on Daniel, "giving time, giving money, giving chances. I would have given you this too if you'd only asked with honesty instead of pressure. But you came with demands, not respect. And respect is the only key I'll answer to." Melissa looked down at the floor, shame burning on her cheeks. Emily pressed closer to her grandfather, her small voice carrying into the silence. "I knew you'd be okay, Grandpa. Daniel tried one last time, his voice cracking. "Dad, you don't understand. This was supposed to be for us, for me, for Emily, for the future." Richard's eyes softened at the mention of his granddaughter. "The future," he said, "is built on truth, not tricks, and certainly not signatures forced from a trembling hand." The clock on the wall ticked once, twice, filling the silence that followed. Daniel slumped back in his chair, defeated. For the first time in years, Richard felt taller, not in body but in spirit. The kind of tall that comes when a man knows he has stood firm, not for pride but for principle. Mr. Harris slid the envelope back toward Richard, a subtle gesture of acknowledgement. "Your note was wise, Mr. Walker," he said. "Few think to prepare like that." Richard gave a faint smile. "It wasn't just me. Margaret always believed in preparing before the storm came. And though she was gone in that moment, her presence filled the room more strongly than anyone else's. The room slowly exhaled after the storm. Papers still lay on the table, their yellow tabs waiting like silent temptations, but no one reached for them again. The battle was over, and though there had been no shouting victory, the outcome was clear. Daniel pushed back his chair, the scrape loud against the polished floor. His shoulders slumped, his eyes clouded with frustration, but beneath it all, there was something else, a trace of shame or perhaps fear at having been seen for what he was. Melissa rose beside him, her silence more telling than any defense. Without another word, they left the room, their steps hurried, almost embarrassed. The door shut behind them, leaving Richard alone with Emily and Mr. Harris. For the first time that morning, Richard felt the weight in his chest ease. He inhaled slowly, the kind of breath that seemed to fill not only his lungs but his entire being. Across the table, his granddaughter looked at him with wide, admiring eyes. "You were so brave, Grandpa," Emily whispered. Richard smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. "Bravery isn't always loud, sweetheart. Sometimes it's just refusing to give in, even when your hands shake." Her small fingers wrapped around his, and in her touch, Richard felt the legacy he had fought to protect. It wasn't about money or deeds or accounts. It was about showing the next generation, that strength could be quiet and still be unbreakable. Mr. Harris stood, slipping the envelope back across the table. "Mr. Walker, I must commend you. Few come prepared for moments like this. What you wrote, it protected not just your assets but your dignity." Richard accepted the envelope, tucking it back into his jacket. He nodded once. "It wasn't just me. Margaret always believed in being ready before the storm came." His voice softened, a shadow of tenderness brushing every word. "I only followed her wisdom." The manager offered a respectful smile, then excused himself, leaving Richard and Emily alone at the table. They sat there for a while, not speaking, just letting the quiet settle around them. Richard looked down at the small hand in his, at the curious eyes watching him as though he were the strongest man in the world. And in that moment, he realized something important. The true inheritance he would leave was not written in legal documents, but in the memory of how he chose to stand. When they finally rose to leave, sunlight streamed through the tall glass windows, bright and forgiving. Outside, the town bustled as though nothing extraordinary had happened. But inside Richard's heart, something had shifted. Quiet justice had been served. Not with gavel strikes or angry words, but with foresight, patience, and the steady echo of a promise whispered long ago by the woman he loved. As he walked out with Emily's small hand in his, Richard felt Margaret with him, her presence not in photographs or faded letters, but in the choices he made to honor her wisdom. And for the first time in a long time, he did not feel old or tired or cornered. He felt strong, strong enough to carry both the past and the future without ever signing away what mattered most. Thank you, dear friends, for staying with us through this story. Here at Family Shadows, we believe that every quiet act of justice, every stand for dignity, leaves behind a lesson worth carrying. If today's story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe, so you'll never miss another journey into the strength of family and the wisdom of fathers. Until we meet again, may your home be filled with love, your days with peace, and your family with happiness. Stay well, and blessings to you and yours.